And I'm really looking forward to this discussion because some of you folks really have some experience that can be brought to bear and without giving away any trade secrets, help the newer folks who are trying to figure out what to do when the manager says, I need your budget for next year by the end of the week. And I remember a time, and many of you do, when the FCC rules demanded that a station have a spare for every major part in inventory in case of inspection. And there was a monthly parts budget. There was the opportunity for the chief engineer to look ahead, not just for what had to happen in terms of the transmitters or studio gear, but the parts that kept them going, the tower inspections, the air conditioning work, all those things. And then we reached a point, I think it was in the mid-late 80s, when radio became a commodity. And the emphasis was on cutting expense. And I saw it happen two different ways. I saw stations where, sadly, chief engineers looked and said, oh, I have X number of dollars a month to spend. I'll go to the manager, and if he gives me a raise, I'll cut that by 2/3 or more. And then I ran into a station where you had to contact corporate if you wanted to spend more than $50. Some of you are going to tell me that you've run into stations where spending anything required somebody to countersign from corporate. Now, where do we start? It's not just maintenance. I had an email from someone today commenting about a transmitter that's been on the air almost 30 years, solid state transmitter, mostly reliable service. But at what point does that transmitter need to be replaced? Because the parts get expensive. And this is where we come to ROI, return on investment. So again, I'm going to invite your comments and your experiences, depending on where you would like to jump in on this. But let's just start in general. Budget for the next fiscal year. Usually starting in October, sometimes in January. How big a broadcast engineering budget should there be, aside from, well, is the engineer part of the budget anymore? I'm sure you've run into stations, some of you guys that do contract work, where the manager only calls you when something's broken, does not want you to come out and do an inspection on an irregular basis.
Then you should be on a retainer.
Oh, exactly. Exactly. So what is the right approach here? If you're a working chief engineer, and maybe I can really put you on the spot, Mark, what do you do in terms of budgetary each year?
I always stayed in touch with corporate, and we would discuss larger items like dry air pumps or spare tubes or anything, and they'd say, put that on capital next year. And so by the time we got around to it, I pretty much, unless something urgent had occurred between the talking to them and putting it on paper, we had the capital ready. So then it was just routine stuff, how much do you spend on air filters every month? And I always modified my transmitters where I could go to Home Depot and buy off the shelf central air conditioner filters and drop them in quickly, get them in bulk. So I never really, unless there was a major project going on, like building a new facility or something, I never really had a big problem with getting the capital done and the budget for the following year done. And I'm talking over a long period of time. I'm talking about the early 70s until 3 years ago.
Okay. How much did you get to spend monthly on parts and services?
Usually probably a couple of $100. And that was a rough month. Meaning like maybe something broke or I had to get some tools or anything. But normally we would capitalize anything major, anything over so many dollars had to be capitalized. And as long as it, legally could be capitalized.
But if you
So-
capitalize it, if you make it part of your CapEx budget, you're saying you're going to buy it next year. You're not going to solve it when it's in need.
Right. In need was just usually the judgment of how many filters, how much soap, spares you'd need during the year. And if something happened, like not a fire, but we had small fires, like a static eliminator might burn up or something like that. I'd call corporate and they'd say, get us the lowest price, of course, and get 3 quotes. And if it could be fixed, I'd send it off and fix it. If it couldn't be fixed, everybody would discuss it and we'd replace it.
So you're saying, in essence, that corporate wise, they recognized that there would be issues and they were ready to fill that financial hole when necessary.
I got lucky the last time. I thought maybe I was going to become corporate chief engineer, but instead the owner passed away and his secretary became president of the company. And so she made her husband corporate chief engineer. And but that kind of worked out because he was always calling me and asking me questions about stuff he didn't know. So we discussed a lot of stuff and we actually kind of became friends. And so usually it would work out.
Okay.
Being polite helps.
All right. Well, let's either CapEx or maintenance. Anyone want to make a comment before I raise another question?
So Barry, I've got a little bit of experience on being a corporate guy for a couple of big broadcast groups, mainly TV, but they had radio as well. And the way we used to do things, and probably a lot of you have been on the end of this, is we would do our budget for the company for the year. It would include operating expenses, OPEX, maintenance items, and et cetera on the technical side. And then of course, a CapEx budget. The CapEx budget would vary depending on year to year as far as how much money that they had anticipated they would have for capital. It could be $5 million for a year. It could be $1 million for a year. And we figure out these budgets when we do our year-end budget meetings the prior year about how much we would have to spend. So I had a pretty good idea on what we'd have available. And then I'd have all my chiefs send me their anticipated projects. I'd give them usually a month or so to come up with their anticipated CapEx projects for the year. And if there were going to be any anticipated maintenance costs. For example, back in the days, we were running IoT tubes and transmitters, which would be what, 60 grand a pop. Okay, what's the life on tubes and et cetera. And then we try and bake that into the budget and sort of divvy up the kitty for both capital and OPEX. And then we'd go ahead and go through. Usually I'd have calls with all the chief engineers. And we also had an advance of the projects being submitted for capital was hurdle rate. One company required a 29% hurdle rate on any CapEx project. It could be, I need a new switcher. Well, that's easy. But a new graphic system, that's a little harder of a hurdle rate. So then the engineer would have to get together with their general manager and try and figure out how to justify dropping that kind of money on a new graphic system or a new set for for news, for TV. And, for a while there, it became this, well, our ratings will improve. It's like, well, okay, are you going to guarantee your ratings will improve? Or, can we guarantee an extra 29% increase in ratings? And how are you going to justify that? So we have to sometimes work together and get creative on trying to come up with that 29% hurdle rate.
Did you have a specific amount every year, or a percentage of gross, or how were you told what you could? Now, you mentioned the tubes. I mean, that isn't really so much a cap expense as an op, because you're going to have to spend that.
Yeah, that's an operational expense, although IoTs we would capitalize. And the reason was because they were so darn expensive. And they had an estimated life cycle of several years. So the company was able to amortize that cost as a capital expense over time. Whereas, let's say just a triode or something in a radio transmitter, that was just an operational expense.
Mm-hmm. So did they, as you come into the next year, did they say, well, you get 5% of our operating expenses, or you have a $50,000 to spend next year, or don't spend anything unless you have to?
It was never, it could be all over the map. If we had a particularly good election, or if there were elections around there and we had political spending, the prior year, we'd have more money for capital in the upcoming year. A lot of times they would assign more money for CapEx in a year after a good political year, just because we'd have the money. So the thinking was, we've got the money, let's go ahead and spend it while we can, because the year following the election year is not going to be as good.
And that raises the question of, how do you determine what to put into a CapEx? When do you decide to replace the transmitter, the audio console, the audio processor? When do you make that decision? Is it based on election year, or is it based on, well, they're X number of years old, it's time to replace?
And that was kind of a big part of what I used to do was, we've deferred maintenance for a long period of time to the point where we risk catastrophic failure of something. Is there an opportunity to replace these old tube transmitters, and we'll see a 20 to 30% decrease in utility costs, and so with let's say, for example, for the entire group, I would have a $5 million CapEx budget for the year. I'd go ahead and say, okay, everybody, give me your projects. What do you want to do? And tell me how you justify it. And then we go through that list. And if I had, let's say, 3 or 4 transmitter requests, then I'd say, okay, can I go to a vendor and beat them up on price because I'm going to buy 3 transmitters? And then we'll go ahead and bake 3 transmitters into a CapEx project with the discounts. And then whatever money I'd have left, we would go ahead and divvy that up amongst the other projects that would fit under that number. Generally, I'd have a number to work with going in, and then we prioritize it from there.
I see. Yeah. How many stations were splitting at 5 million?
Oh, let's see. I had, well, if you consider the LPs and full class TVs, I had 19 TVs and 4 radios.
Okay. So if you are the chief engineer of a particular standalone station or cluster, do you put in every year that you want a new transmitter?
It depends. It's based on the age of the transmitter. Maybe parts aren't available as much anymore. And then there's a risk. I never wanted to be in a position where I'd say a certain station is down altogether and off the air and we're having trouble getting parts. So if things were starting to get shaky, I'd rely on my chief engineers to tell me if things are getting a little dicey, and then that would be moved up the priority list.
It's almost like your automobile. You could have a lovely automobile, and unless you're one of those people that financially you just trade it in every other year or something like that. You get out to a certain point, and it might be 5 years, it might be 7, it might be 10. And now you're saying, well, no, we're getting to a point that, well, something's going to happen. It just does because of age. And therefore, you start to plan to make that expensive purchase. Cell phone.
Also, companies changed a lot in the last 5 years. And like somebody get bought out by somebody else, or they get bought out by a foreign company, and then they start making more solid state stuff. And so everything, the last 5 years, everything's changed quite a bit differently
Well,
on
sure.
how you plan on a new transmitter.
Well, there's less that's a great point. There's less manufacturers out there to shop from now. If you want to go buy an AM transmitter, you've pretty much only got one choice. Whereas before you'd have what, 3 or 4? And the same goes on the TV side of things. Companies like Grass Valley, which used to be a one-stop shop for everything, got purchased by its second private equity firm recently, and has been, shut down their support group, shut down their engineering group, and are gradually and laid off a bunch of salespeople, and it looks like are gradually piecemealing selling their various divisions within Grass Valley. And Gates Air sold out recently to, was it Tomcast again? So
Gates, Harris, Gates, on and on.
Exactly. So, whatever you think of them now in their current state, we don't know what they're going to be like, not like the old days, 5-10 years from now.
And they've already basically phased out support for a lot of the transmitters that many of us grew up with. Mary Schnelly, I know you're out there somewhere, and I'm going to ask this question. Kelly just said, if you're buying AM, you have one choice. I think that might be a little overstated, but are you finding more of your customers asking for these other companies that you represent than the top 1 or 2?
Yes. And of course it depends on the market. Like it depends on budget. I mean, that dictates a lot of what people buy.
But if they buy the wrong product, I had a station owner down here that I was doing contract work for, and I came into the studio one day and he's crowing, I just bought a brand new master control console and it only cost me $2,500. And my response was, in the next 6 months, you're going to spend more than that just on repairs and maintenance. Oh, no. Well, that's what happened. So, Mary, how do you guide people into making the right decision, not just saving money today, but looking ahead toward how long this gear is going to work?
Well, I mean, ultimately it's their choice. But for me, it's telling them what you know. Like I'll use a Behringer console, for instance. They're inexpensive, they're fairly good, but they don't last. Like I tell customers they're a throwaway console, because if you send them in to get them repaired, they cost just about as much as a new console. So my advice is, if you're going to use that and you know that you're going to have to replace it in a year and a half, and you're okay with it, that's kind of what you have to do. I mean, like, there are, we wrap several different transmitters. We have RVR, we sell Nautel, I've sold some Elanos, and in that, like the RVR, they're good solid boxes, but they don't have the bells and whistles like a Nautel. I mean, that's kind of what, sometimes cheap is a good product, and it saves you money. and then sometimes it's not. It just depends on the application.
How about after sales support? Do you find a difference between the Nautels and the Gates Airs and the RVRs? And
I don't find that the components are replaced. I think they're probably kind of equal. But then again, for transmitters, it depends on your site. You know, is it a clean site? Is it cooled? Those are all things that add to the lessening of the life of a transmitter.
that's for sure.
And even so, some transmitters will last longer in such a nasty environment than others. We just had to get rid of a Continental 816R2 at one of my sites that had been abused for 35 years. And by golly gosh, it was on its last legs when it went, but it went down like a gamer. It really tried. There's now a Nautel out there, and they finally got air conditioning into the place. But it was the first time in the 40 years that the transmitter had been up, that the transmitter side had been up, that they actually had air conditioning in there. It's a much better environment for the transmitter to work in. I think I have an advantage on this situation with regards to budgets and so forth, because I worked for 20 years for Crawford Broadcasting Company, and I'm here to tell you, nobody does it better. If anybody has a moment, if you want me to share a moment with you, I'll tell you in a nutshell what the process is, and it's very straightforward. Is that okay, Barry?
I didn't quite hear what you said, Art, because you're a little soft on level. So go right ahead and restate.
All right, I'll do my best. All right.
There you go.
Crawford's process starts in August, right about now, with inventory. Inventory is very thorough. I won't try to describe that, but I use their inventory template for all the work I do at all of my consultancies now in taking inventory for what's going on. And it even gets down to what the insurance will pay for and what the management will consider its replaceability. Once the inventory is in, the next thing they'll do, it's usually about October, is to request from all the market chiefs the things that they need for the following year. Sometimes the corporate will actually force feed stuff. I remember one year we got a whole bunch of CD players that we didn't think we needed. But when it comes to the big ticket items like transmitters, we've already discussed this before, and we don't have to ask for them because the boss will tell us that you're getting a new transmitter this year or a new antenna or whatever big ticket item it is. So then we go through the budget process. We ask for things that we believe we need that hasn't really gotten through to corporate yet. All of those go down to the boss, that is, in this case, Chris Alexander. He takes all of those requests to corporate. He actually goes into corporate and he makes the pitch for thus and so and thus and so. And I was very gratified in my entire 20 years there that about 90% of the things I requested was approved. And then we had to schedule a time of the year for the purchase to be made. And that was arranged between Chris and the market chiefs as he went out and visited the various markets. And then we went through the purchase and installation. And about the time that was done, it was time for another inventory. But
That's one of the benefits of having a large group like that you have the experience, because probably the most touchy thing, especially today, when so many stations don't have an auxiliary transmitter, when do you get the transmitter changed out?
That's a very straightforward answer. The typical life in main service for a transmitter at Crawford was 10 years. It
10
was
years.
then relegated to backup service, and the previous backup transmitter was replaced. They just went through that now. They just got a GB30 and got rid of the 22-year-old BEFM30T that I installed. As a matter of fact, I ended up driving that thing down to Alabama. We're going to try and put it back on the air at another station soon. The point of the matter is that we have gone through 2 generations of transmitters in the time since I started working there. And I worked there for 20 years and I left there about almost 10 years ago. And they're on the next set of transmitters already. Now, this is a very well-run company and it is rather profitable. And I cannot tell you how benevolent a boss Mr. Crawford is. However, from the engineering side, we had the situation down pat. And now I'm trying to convince some of my larger clients that you need to go down this path yourself. We have a transmitter at one of my current consultancies, which is 27 years old. I'll be honest, it's a BEFM4C. Tried to get parts for those things lately. We have a serious problem in the power supply section. We need a power supply that they don't make anymore. They have to rebuild them all. And furthermore, the backplane, the modular backplane of the power supply bank is defective. And we just found out they don't make those parts and you can't get them anymore. And I got to sit there and tell my boss, looky, you're going to have to make plans in the next 2 to 3 years to do thus and so. I have a 5-year plan developed for this guy. And I'm telling him what he's going to need to have and in what time frame. And I'm going to keep, pounding on him until he starts realizing. Now he's crying property, and I believe him because his vice president of finance tells me, she tells me the straight scoop. So, we're everybody's honest with each other. But I'm telling him, you want to stay on the air, you want to stay on the air reliably, you want to stay legal, you want to stay sounding good. Now you just replaced your automation and you had to. But now we got to start looking further down the road as to what we're going to do for new equipment to keep this place legal, reliable, and sounding good. And this is an old line broadcaster. He's been doing it all his life. His father was into it. So
All right, good. So your return on investment on a transmitter is 10 years. Is there anyone with us today? You don't have to tell us the call sign. Are you running a transmitter that's over 10 years old?
Oh, man, all of mine were over 10
Yep.
years old. They were
Yep.
there when I started 13 years ago, and I replaced 2 transmitters in that entire time. And when you get to where you can't get parts, that's when there's no problem getting it replaced. But
That's too late.
most of them were Harris's. They were sold to them by Steve Schott. And you could still get parts for them. And one of them was an old, it was a Gates from when they originally called it Gates. And that one I couldn't get an IPA. So I rebuilt an old Energy Onyx that was up in Roswell, and that cost $12,000. It was a 25 kilowatt transmitter. That lasted 5 years, and then I stuck in a Nautel, an NV10LT. So that was one of the new ones I got. And then the AM, it was a Gates 5, and I ran it, and it started being hard to get some of the parts, but not terrible. And somebody offered us something for it, and so we got X.
Yeah,
The
that's
5
the
kilowatt.
warning sign when parts are becoming
Exactly.
unobtainable. Mark,
Exactly.
you stuck your hand up there. What's going on?
No, well, we've got two tube type transmitters, BE FM 25Ts. One of them is actually 11 years old, and the other one is 14 and a half years old. And we've replaced the one that's 14 and a half years old with the new Nautel. Of course, relegated the transmitter to a backup, and hopefully it's the last tube I'll ever have to buy. And then the other one up north is 11 years old. We'll be replacing that this next year with a new Nautel. It will also become a backup transmitter, and I think we've got it up to snuff as far as all the parts we're going to ever need to put in it. Of course, when they become backup, they don't run as often, obviously.
And you don't know if they're going to start up.
Well, it's a good rule of thumb to fire the thing up at least once a month and switch it over and let it run for even 15 minutes.
Yep. I know of a station where they did not even test their Jenny for over a year and a half.
Yep,
You
Yep.
guess what happened?
yep,
Art,
exactly.
by the way, just for your delectation, one of the Native Americans out here have an FM4C. And one of the things I've finally got them to do is get that to change out. Electricity. Do you find that putting in a solid state transmitter pays for itself in reduced costs of operation?
Yes.
Particularly a 50 kilowatt AM. We went from a 310 or 312 Continental to a Gates HD, Gates, the 50 kilowatt, whatever it was called. I can't think of it now, the solid state one.
DX.
Yeah. And we went from $2,700 a month to about $600 a month. And the bookkeeper came in and he said, "Are we on full power?" And I said, "Yeah." "And what does the bookkeeper give a damn about full power?" And he said, "Well, I think there's something wrong. This bill's too low." And I said, "That's what it's supposed to be." We went from 30% efficiency to 70% efficiency on that transmitter. And he said, "Well, that's going to pay for itself." I said, "Yeah, in 5 years."
So what you're saying is that as part of the CapEx procedure, the engineer needs to do an energy cost audit at the site, just like you would do an audit of other costs.
Particularly on a 50 kilowatt AM.
And I would add to that, that not only are you saving on the cost of electricity to run the transmitter, you are also saving a great deal on the cost to heat and cool, or to cool that building. Since the transmitter building is a year-round cooling load, we found out when we switched out of the Continental H16R4 to the Nautel NV20 LT, that the building, the exhaust temperature went from 156 degrees to 83 degrees. If you don't think that isn't going to save you, and by the way, the big air conditioner that had been used to cool the Continental conked out, we're able to go from a 6-ton unit to a 3-ton unit, which saved us right there.
Plus, you can keep the room more sealed off when you don't have that much heat having to be replaced with cool. And so you can keep it cleaner.
Barry,
Yes, sir.
I don't want to take this in a direction, another direction, but your best friend or your worst enemy at a station is the guy with MBA at the end of his name. Now, the good guys, you can sit down with them and you can say, "Here's how this has to go. Here's what it means. And these are the important points to us." And the bad guys will say, "Hey, just bought you a new transmitter." And that's the gamut. And it scares me to death when I'm working with the guys who are just shoot from the hip kind of. We saved $5,000 by buying this brand, as opposed to someone who will walk into your office and say, "What do you think? We got this, we got that. What do you want to do?"
Very good point. And that brings us right back to Mary, and she reps Nautel and she reps RVR.
Hey, Len, how about a CPBE and an MBA? Would you throw me out of your office?
No,
I had
but
that told to me all the time at the Georgia network, those damn MBAs in Atlanta, and I had to say, "You're talking to them."
Mark, I got 3 of them in the family. They all hate MBAs. But I will tell you that if you have both certificates, I want to come sit in the corner and watch you fight with yourself.
There's no fight whatsoever. If you get above the fray, you understand everything. You're a better shot at it.
What I've been slowly edging toward here, and here Len has put his finger on it. Before you even start with a CapEx budget, I think Kelly touched on this as well. You need to find out what your existing running costs are. You need to find out where, if you will, sitting to use a bad metaphor, a rowboat, where the leaks are, where the money is going that shouldn't necessarily be leaking. And that's where you make your choices as to what to replace in the next year or so. It's nice to have a brand new console or transmitter or whatever, shiny. But if you're the conservator of the funds of your department, you need to know where those monies are going. Hence my mention about doing an energy audit. In the old days, we used to also do a telephone audit. It's all IP now, so it's not quite the same. But every station I used to find 3 or 4 phone lines that were unused. Nobody knew what they were, but they were paying for them every month. But let's
I got one other comment. Guess who paid for my MBA, you all?
it
Then-
wasn't your cameraman, I know that.
No, it was Harris Corporation, Gates Radio. They paid for my MBA. There is some wisdom at the corporate levels, much less at Georgia Public Broadcasting, for being savvy and educated on business.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Just one other point, Mark. I had one station in particular where a new ops guy came in with an MBA, and he looked at the phone bill and said, "This is ridiculous. We're cutting this, 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 and this." And he did it on his own, including the T1. So, you know, they were down for a day while we figured out what was going on. This is going back 10 years ago. But while we figured out what was going on and why AT&T couldn't get them back up.
Those stories are a bunch of nonsense. Come on, guys.
What?
You need to know finance and accounting and stuff. And if you're ignorant to the trade you're in, you need to have your engineer help you, or you need to become that engineer yourself.
That's a great line. And it is that MBAs know all about business. They don't know about your business.
I got a
So
double
you
E,
hit-
a CPBE, and an MBA. What's your problem?
I don't
Well,
have a problem.
There are all MBAs that know what the hell they're doing.
That goes in all aspects here. Talking about EAS,
Absolutely true.
all the people at the FCC and the FEMA that are telling us what has to happen, or all the forms they want you to fill in. They've never worked a day in their lives in a radio station. With a
I'm
few
Charles
exceptions.
Cooper. I mean, I've got a list of FCC people that are come out of the broadcast business.
A few, not very many. No, they're mostly old lawyers now. Let's talk about the maintenance end of things here, the OPsEX budget. How often do you get your tower inspected, your guy wires, your guy anchors? How often do you do that? Anyone?
Every 3 years, I have towers checked.
Good.
When we
Plumbed-
do the
Plumb, tension,
pre-selection thing every 3 years so that you don't get inspected, the self, checkout.
and then of course every quarter, I do a look over the tower and the tower lights to be sure that everything's working. Of course, that's required.
Mhm. How about paint? How often do you paint?
Well, it depends. If you've got strobes up there and they run day and night, you don't. However, I am in a situation where 2 of my towers at least are sitting out in the middle of farmers' fields, and I can't get to the guy anchors, make that 3 towers. I can't get to the guy anchors until late fall when the harvesting's done, or early spring before they start planting. And that becomes a hassle. One client requires me to check all the guy lines quarterly, but the problem is that's one of the towers that's in the middle of the farmer's field. The good news is we have one rental tower, my biggest client, and it's by American Tower. They own the tower. However, the regional manager is one of my better friends. So we watch each other's backs, and I do occasional inspection of his situation. But really, the best way to inspect a tower is with a tower climber who A, knows what he's doing, and B, has the kind of equipment it takes to check the guy tensions on those towers. And that begs the question of how often do you do that? Because that ends up being an expensive proposition.
Sure, that comes back to the changing culture of the industry, where you have the tower companies now that are buying up towers and land, and presumably are maintaining those towers. But just to come back a little bit further again, that as you prepare your budget and you want to look at what needs to be spent over the coming year, those towers and that paint, I don't know that putting a strobe up all by itself is going to reduce the need to paint a tower.
Depends on the tower's age.
It's going to depend upon the tower, of course. But if you've been painting a tower and you put a strobe on the top of it, that does not change the need to protect the steel.
Well, we have legacy towers here in Chicago, as you know, and they must be inspected and painted. As a matter of fact, the late great Warren Schultz put incandescent lights on WLS's tower in 2004 when he could have put on strobes and or LEDs, but he wanted that tower inspected yearly because the tower is vintage 1936. WGN's tower is vintage 1939. WSCR's tower is vintage, I think it's 1951.
WGN's about to have a new tower.
Oh, there's a back and forth about that going all around the place. Frankly, I don't know whether they're going to, the last I heard, they're not going to replace the tower. They're going to keep it where it is. It's the south end of the property that's going to be relegated.
Yeah.
And the auxiliary tower is the one that's going to have to be moved.
Somebody figured out how much the replacement tower was going to cost. But you have so many towers that were built in the late 40s and into the 50s that literally are at the end of their lifespan, often because of poor maintenance. Now, I don't think we have anybody with us today that's a tower rigger that would like to talk to this topic.
Especially those with hollow legs.
Yeah, I was, again, just talking to someone this morning. He did an inspection, and sure enough, the weep holes were plugged. I've seen a station where the weep holes were at the top of a section because they put it in upside down. Nobody ever stopped to check on it.
One of the towers we're on out in the west end of the state is a brand new replacement tower for the one that had been there since 62, and it was a hollow leg tower. And as you just indicated, weep holes got plugged, and eventually one of the legs started to split about 50 foot up. This is a 500-foot tower. Fortunately, the owners of the tower realized that they needed to do something, and something quick, because there were at least a couple tenants on that tower besides their, at the time, 3 stations on there. Now they have 4 stations on there. But yeah, you're right.
And for those of you taking notes, another factor here is, do you know if your tower is properly zoned? Or was it a non-conforming waiver when it was put up? More than once in recent years, these 1940s and 50s towers need to come down to be replaced, and you can't do it because the local zoning authority won't permit it. So you need to get to it, as Mark says, before it becomes critical, before the riggers won't climb it, and make sure that you have that structure is in good shape. So what else do we need here in terms of periodic maintenance? You have landscaping. You need to knock down the foliage in a tower site. You need to ensure that the gate on your tower fence, your enclosure, is in good shape. Commission does cite a lot of stations for that. Or if you have a fence surrounding the site, you're going to find some of the locals have cut holes in your fence to walk their dogs or something else. So you're going to have to repair your fence over a period of time.
Steal your copper.
There's so many things here that need to be added. It's not just a matter of, as Ken was saying earlier, $200 a month is going to serve you through the year. You can certainly take care of lots of little things. But if you really want to keep your transmitter site, much less your studio site, in good shape, talk about a studio. You've got to replace those carpets from time to time, or people are going to trip. What else can happen in a studio? Oh, how about the air conditioning systems breaking down? That's got to be factored in there somewhere. Is that something that management is going to take care of without involving the tech department? It bears discussion, doesn't it? We have a lot of folks here today. Many of you are lurking, enjoying the material, but share with us a little bit about how things work at your particular facility. Do you get a lot of cooperation from management, or do you have to fight every step of the way to keep your system running properly?
Here at Spirit, our management team is absolutely fantastic. Our executive director is kind of a techno geek anyway, and has very much into making sure that we have what we need. You were talking earlier, Barry, about having redundant, the FCC requiring that you had certain redundant equipment or parts. We have some of that, and we've even got spare transmitters that they're small, but they're big enough we can throw it in the back of a truck or a van and take it out to a site and at least get it on the air.
N+1 has become a very logical and good solution these days.
Yes, we're very blessed this year that we've managed to get 1, 2, 3, 4 transmitter sites. The ones that I spoke of where we're replacing the transmitters due to age. We managed to come up with the funding to buy RF switches and associated materials to be able to have the ability to switch our transmitters from remotely, which is not something we've ever had, at least not in the 14 years that I've been here. So that's a really great thing too, is to have that ability, at least the station's on the air until the engineer does make it out there when the site's maybe 3, 4, or even 7 hours away. So yeah, we have good support from management here. And
Good.
if the money's there to buy the equipment, then great, it's not a problem. Of course, we're a nonprofit, we're non-commercial. We have to, we live on donations from our listeners and our underwriters. So, but we do have those people out there that also donate money, and they will specifically say, hey, I want this money earmarked for the technical stuff, which is.
Do you have a set amount every year?
Do we have a what?
Set amount every year for your budget?
Not in particular. We kind of sit back and we look for the next year, what we think we're going to need.
Mhm.
And as far as projects, now that the 4 new stations that we're putting on the air, well, 3 more now because we've got 1 under our belt as of last week. But, we sat down and we, figured out, okay, this is what we need for equipment and this is how much it's going to cost. And we even calculated in and just, a certain percentage of inflationary cost because we know the costs are going to go up.
Yeah, they do.
And
Rich Wood, let's explore a little bit here the dynamics between the program director and the engineering department in terms of the budget for the following year.
Well, the I had a very interesting situation at WOR. It's a family-owned company. And I was hired to create the WOR radio network. I was the luckiest person in the company because I got everything I needed without having to budget for it because it was, it was all brand new. One thing, we started with one show, and I had come from ABC. So, I was familiar with their satellite services, and we were leasing, a switched channel. And finally, as we added programming, I said, wouldn't this be better if we had a dedicated channel? And they said, yeah, we're waiting for you to ask that. So I went to Rick Buckley and I said, this is, it's going to cost us $250,000 a year. And he said, do it. And I had the only advertising budget, which really wasn't a budget. The radio station didn't advertise. The network did. And every once in a while I'd get a little nudge from the radio station's GM, you get advertising, I don't. So it was just very easy. Rick Buckley, talk about a techno geek. Rick was an old NBC page, and he's very, very much into broadcasting. So he knew what was required, and we got it.
Probably the worst thing is when the new GM comes in and they don't have that appreciation that Rick had, or some others.
Well, the person that really did the budgeting was Bob Bruno, the GM. And Bob was so persnickety about, keeping things in order. I look at his, he had a bunch of folders, and he knew every penny that the station was spending. He had every contract, and everybody at all the talent had contracts.
Well, let's go from the big city to the other end here. Mr. Conrad, Mr. Gelhaus, you're operating little LPFM stations. How do you handle the budget? Do you have a budget?
Well, I don't have an LP, but when I was dealing with a 4-bay AM up in Trenton, it really was no budget because the income wasn't there to have a budget. They've just basically met their daily operating cost. And
so when things happened, what did you do?
Bubble gum and baling wire. It was, if the money was needed, absolutely needed, they found it somewhere. Whether they borrowed it, printed it, I don't know, whatever, but that's what they had to do there. And when I had the old 900 down here in Philly, of course I beat the studio was built from scratch, so that wasn't too bad the first few years. I think the only thing I had to replace was the stupid light bulbs on the VU meters and the LPB consoles. The transmitter site basically was budgeted for new tubes every 6 months.
That was a family station, wasn't it? I think Dana worked there after you.
Yeah, he came in. Well, that was after we got rid of it. Yeah, back when it was somebody else. Because we only had it for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
But I went through there initially, and fortunately, it was the people that had it before we took it kept it up in pretty good condition, and was kind of warranted.
Could last 3 years without a problem.
Yeah, we knew the tubes were going to be have to be replaced every 6 months. The only thing that actually bit us was when the air conditioner died,
Mhm.
and we got a replacement air conditioner on a trade deal. So
Right. Brian, Chuck, I know you guys have an LPFM. I think I'm waking the sleeping giants here.
Chuck, wake up.
Well, I'm trying to unmute myself here, and it wasn't unmuting, so, but I think you can hear me now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, well, we don't have an LPFM. I mean, I have 2 AM stations and an FM, Class A FM, and 5 translators. And I've got a couple extra transmitters sitting on a shelf back here in the next room behind me, in case one craps out. We were talking about RVR transmitters, and they actually work quite well. But if you do need technical support, and I haven't, that's the good news. You'd better speak Italian, because when you call their Miami phone number, they go ciao. You know, when they answer the phone. But like I say, I haven't had any real trouble with the things. I'm sure a lot of our stuff is going to have to be rotated out at some time or other, because this has been going on since 2002, I think, on and off. But just try and fix things as they go and keep them working. That's about the best thing you can do, as far as I know. If you see something getting ready to go bad, it's time to go do something about it, rather than put it off.
I thought for sure you were an LPFM. I'm sorry.
No, well, we started out as an LPFM. In 2012, it was the low power FM station, and then ended up donating that to a church who later lost interest in it, but because I went commercial. So we're sitting here with a commercial station and 2 AMs too, and all commercial. And actually, we've been pretty lucky, I guess. But I don't know where you're going to find another AM transmitter other than Nautel or BE. That's it. And I've had both, and there's got to be a third choice somewhere. I guess there's Armstrong, but I'm not sure that's a choice or not, but maybe. We try to have backup stuff, and
there's a lot of Continental 317s for sale.
Yeah. I don't really think we want to get something that's an antique, though. I mean, we've already got antiques.
But
so.
they're
I don't
cheap.
think it fit in your room either.
No,
It might
no,
go in your museum.
We don't have room in the museum either. I mean, I've had people, well, actually, somebody brought us a 35 kilowatt FM, RCA FM transmitter. I couldn't tell you what model it is, but it's the most butt ugly looking thing I've ever seen in my life. And the power supply for it is about at least the size of the desk I'm sitting on or sitting at. And I have no idea where we're going to put this thing. We got it in storage right now. One of our volunteers put wheels on it, which was a big help because it weighs, 4 billion pounds or something. But it's not particularly pretty to look at. It needs a paint job real bad to even make it look pretty. The exciter is missing, although we do have an exciter that's the right one for it, sitting in storage. So I guess I could put that in, but it's ugly. And I don't think, curb appeal is a lot of things in the museum. So, but we keep ourselves busy fixing things, what can you say? But luckily, since there's only really 3 of us running the radio station, and we keep one of them away, because some people have better luck with computers than others. And, everything seems to be okay. But between Brian and myself, we seem to be able to keep things working. Our big adventure this week is we changed our main landline phone over to voice over IP. And that was kind of interesting, but it's going to save us about $170 a month or something. So that seems like a good idea. So we're all, and I guess I'm in a different situation because I'm really a small broadcaster, and I'm the boss, I'm the engineer. So is Brian, the engineer. He's operations, but he can fix stuff too and rewire things. So you ever
fight with yourself?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Do you lose those arguments?
I know we've got to go buy this thing, but on the other hand, I really don't feel like spending the money. That kind of happens. But luckily, my background is basically technical, so I'm in favor of making electrons happy.
If he were still with us, David Stewart could speak to that very much so. his La Mesa station was exactly what you're saying. You need to do this, but don't want to do this.
Yeah, well, David and I were two peas in a pod in a way. He's a better engineer, was a better engineer than me by far, but we commiserated quite a bit. I think we had a lot in common.
Mhm. Any other thoughts here on things?
You know, Barry, you were talking about budgets and things like that, and I think it kind of went like this.
Mhm.
A lot. And I think Mark had a good point, many good points, and the other fellow, Len, was talking about his MBA. And the thing that kept coming to mind when Len was talking about MBAs, it doesn't matter what letters you have after your name if you're in the business office and you're in charge of budgets, or you're the finance guy, you're the CFO, you're the whatever the label is, and you're in charge of money. They don't want to spend money. That's obvious, and it all depends on your company, from small, medium, big, corporate, they need justification, they need reasoning. They don't specifically need to be MBA people. They just want to get in the way of spending the company's money. I think that's their role, and they want to be smart about it, so it happens, I would say the smaller market companies and smaller market groups, it's a little more intimate, but as you start raising the size of the company, it gets a lot less intimate. And
Mike, that's a good thing. What you're talking about is a good thing there. And the important thing, you kind of touched on it, is that the person making the financial decisions knows what's going on in our business and knows what he has to be doing, what he has to be underwriting or approving is going to help the station. A lot of guys, this is not a fair statement. Some guys, you explain MDCL to them and they will say, well, that's a 5-year payout. I need to make this work this year. And say, okay, all right, well, if that's what you need, that's what you need, but just got to know it's out there. So,
and I think another problem, and I think a lot of us can agree with this, is that we as engineering people, and those of us who are not the best communicators in general. It's a typical thing that we've all seen, and I think I knew it from college. How many engineers that were studying engineering when I was in engineering school, they couldn't communicate for a hill of beans, but they could, do whatever on the engineering and mathematical side and, answer a question, but try to communicate, try to do public speaking, not that that's required, but I mean, it's like, you should be able to get up in front of a meeting of, your department, managers and talk, and that's always been the problem. And I think that parlays into the financial people and even the owners and upper managers not trusting the knowledge coming from the engineering people.
You literally beat me to it. I was literally going to talk about that aspect, that what I'm trying to sum up here, and you can tell me if I'm in the right track or not. The technical person who is working on a CapEx budget or an OPEX budget needs to do three things very carefully. Watch what's gone on over the past year, looking ahead, do a audit of the expenses and what's going on, and 3, learn how to communicate to the management in a way that doesn't seem like it's take it or leave it.
And it's not, x squared plus y squared equals z squared.
Mhm.
They have no clue what that means or any of that stuff.
Plus they think it's black magic.
You got to dumb it down. Know your audience. How many times have you heard that in the media? Know your audience.
There's some joke that's out there on the internet about, I think, a helicopter pilot in the Seattle area, and he was lost or something, and the thing went on and on and on. He says, "Oh, you're working for Microsoft," and the end of it was that it was engineering talking to him, telling him all the wonderful things he could do to figure out where he was, but it didn't help him because he didn't know where he was.
Let me make a comment. I worked for two Fortune 500 companies, Scientific Atlanta / Cisco and Harris Corporation. At Harris Corporation, they ran a Harris University for anybody with a science or engineering undergrad and sent you down to Melbourne for 12 weeks. And I did that in the summer of 1982 and ran you through the first semester of MBA through University of Florida at Gainesville, PhDs. And it was the intention of the company to get their technical folks a little more savvy on the business end of it because they had too many people in the laboratories and stuff not paying attention to budgets. So they called that Harris U, and we all called it Charm School, but I don't need to tell you that I went to Charm School. But a lot of corporations do this, and Scientific Atlanta wanted to re-enroll me, and I had to sit down with them and say, didn't you read my resume? Do you need my transcript? I've already done this once. And of course, by then, I'd also transferred those undergrad credits, which I did, the CEUs, Quincy University in Quincy, Illinois, a fine Franciscan institution, took that for undergrad. And I just had to do the grad hours. But this is a well-known situation. This is nothing new. And a lot of companies are trying to catch up as far back as 1982. How's that sound?
So as part of ongoing education, station engineer or technical support staff need to learn how to present these things to management that make sense. You need to learn the one sheet, 3 bullet point, rather than a 15-page treatise on why you need to replace something.
For Harris, I believe that school was actually called cheap school because that's all they did was shorten a wire 1/4 of an inch so that they could save money when they built it.
You mean the Harris University thing that Dr. Boyd put on down in Melbourne?
I remember I put the new DX50 in, and 3 days later it quit working. So I looked and looked and looked, and it was the first time I had a DX50. So I called the factory, and the guy walked me through everything in that transmitter, and he said, I'll have to call you back tomorrow. So the next day, someone else calls me, and we go through everything. And I mean, and finally he says, go around behind the left panel or the right panel as you face it from the front and reach in where the exciter is, and you'll follow that cable that's got the 13 on it and just go all the way back, and it'll turn left and go left, and there's a B and C. He said, tug on the cable, and I did, and it just fell out in my hand. And he says, okay, bring it back around to the front and go straight back and hook it up. Your problem solved. And I said, why is that cable too short? And he said, they saved 1/4 of an inch on that little RG 58 cable. And I said, what's the big deal with the 1/4 inch? He says, that's just Harris.
Well, that's an undeserved slam. Have you ever seen the Harris factory and the wiring harnesses being put together, and you think 1/4 inch on an RG58 is any in that equation?
It sure seemed to be on that transmitter, and that was the problem with it.
That's a manufacturing defect. I had the same thing on some VHF Platinums, 10 of them, 210 kilowatts, and the connector to go down in it, I forget the name of it, but it was loose. And they told me, oh, we buy those from Mexico and they come loose. So all I had to do is tighten it up. But that's happened on my Chevrolet too, you know.
It was like in the old days, their audio consoles, you throw a selector switch and you only got the right channel and you had to jiggle it and go in and clean the switch.
Yeah. Well, I've got an order in on a Cybertruck. Do you think that'll solve the problems?
Are they still around? I mean, which company owns Harris now? I mean, owns Gates now, or whatever it's called now.
Thompson.
Gates Air.
Thompson bought it. Thompson, French. They bought it from the Gores Group, which was a holding company. Quite successful one, by the way.
Okay, anyone have a question you'd like to pose about budgets and such that we could answer? Anyone have an issue that in their particular case, they'd like some guidance to be shared from the experience.
Barry, I'd like to make just a quick comment. So
Please.
especially with the advertising headwinds that our industry, both radio and TV, are facing, less ads around, smaller markets, big box stores don't buy ads on the local radio station anymore. And restaurants and health clubs and such as that are hard to collect from. So the broadcast industry right now is under a lot of pressure. And I think the comment was made earlier that you need to, instead of take an adversarial role against the finance people in the company, you need to understand where they're coming from and, be aware at least of what their job is versus what your job is, and be able to translate technobabble to finance speak to get your point across. And don't ask for things that you don't need. I used to counsel, I had a couple of grizzled engineers who worked for me. And a couple of times they hit me with well, if you want to stay on the air, you better do this. And I have a finely tuned BS meter. And I said, don't ever say that again to me, unless you have a plan for why this needs to be replaced as soon as you need it replaced, and how we're going to either save money or continue making money by keeping this on the air in a more succinct manner. I'm not going to take anything that you have to say with any sort of gravity. So, I think it's a matter of now, it's like, don't ask for anything unless you absolutely could show that you need it, and that it's either going to save the company money or it's going to keep the company making money. But it's important to one of the reasons that I was elevated to corporate status on a couple of occasions was I was always told I was able to translate technobabble into business speak, and technical folks who can do that, especially with the cutbacks and companies going to more just contract engineering, and even contract guys could benefit by that, in being able to translate technobabble into business speak, will be around a lot longer than the ones who are just going to dig their heels in and say, well, by God, I'm a radio guy, or by God, I'm a TV guy, and I'm going to just work on transmitters because that's what I know how to do. That isn't going to hold for long in this particular environment that we're up against right now.
No, you're right. Exactly. And we need to be cautious. We need to explain ourselves, but to really, in most cases, consider the company's money as important as we consider our own.
Exactly. Yep.
Don't waste it. Don't waste it.
Some time ago, probably 50 years ago, I was lucky enough to have a mentor who said, you got to think in terms of number of spots. You want to buy a new final tube, how many spots is this going to cost the company? And work back from there.
I had a station one time come to me, and they really wanted it was a TV station, a small market, Eureka, California. And they said, we want a generator at our studio. And I said, okay, well, I get the generator at the transmitter, but I said, how many power outages have you had at the studio in the 20 years that you've been there? And he said, 1. And I said, well, how many minutes was that power outage? How long did that last? This is about 30 minutes, but our UPSs gave up the ghost and I had to restart everything. And I said, well, when was that? He goes, oh, like 10 years ago. I said, and how much ad revenue was lost in that outage? And then put that up against how much that generator is going to cost to maintain, and et cetera. I said, it's a tough sell for me to go to upper management and advocate for a $60,000 box on the possibility that something might happen.
Got to make it justifiable.
Exactly.
Well, actually, in New York, it becomes justifiable by losing an awful lot of money in that 30 minutes.
Yeah, but that isn't Eureka, California.
It's a little busier, yeah.
Now we have some GMs who have done away with their chief engineer because, as they say, if I have a transmitter burn up after 3 years, I'm broken even. Now, he may be off the air for a week, or given the supply problems today, off the air for a month. That doesn't matter. He's broken even with his engineering costs.
Well, that, or they might have business interruption insurance, and it's like, okay, well, I'm covered until we can get it fixed.